Before we get started, take a second to get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and if you're enjoying these quiet dives into the past, consider subscribing, but only if you feel like it. Maybe leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see where in the world you're tuning in. Now take a deep breath, and let's drift back in time together. The life of a Roman gladiator didn't begin with roaring crowds or dramatic duels. It began in the dark, long before the Roman city stirred, before the marketplace buzzed with merchants and gossip, before the temples opened their grand stone doors, and before even the first cook fires sparked to life. The gladiators were already awake, or more accurately, being forced awake. In the suffocating quiet of the ludus, the gladiator training school, there was no such thing as peace. The air itself felt thick, like it had weight. The smell of oil, blood, unwashed bodies, and mildew clung to everything: your clothes, your skin, the straw you slept on. It never left. The walls were stone, tall and oppressive, trapping the heat in summer and hoarding the cold in winter. They didn't echo with laughter or even whispers, just the occasional grunt of pain and the sharp, cold voice of command. There was no sunrise in here, just flickering torches throwing cruel shadows across the floor, and sometimes the vicious snap of a whip slicing through silence. Most gladiators weren't volunteers. They weren't chasing glory. They were enslaved men, prisoners of war, criminals sentenced to the arena, or victims of debt and desperation. Some had once commanded armies or tended fields. Some had families. Some had names. Others didn't anymore. Stripped of identity, they were bought like cattle and trained like weapons. Their past lives were distant memories, and waking up meant returning to a reality where the future was blood-stained and uncertain. Sleep, for these men, was a rare mercy. There were no soft beds or warm blankets, just thin, lumpy mats tossed on cold stone, straw that scratched your skin, and maybe, if you were lucky, a worn piece of cloth to throw over your shoulders. Rats were common companions. The cold in winter cut to the bone. In the summer, the air thickened with the suffocating stench of sweat and rot. You didn't rest. You endured. And when the iron-latched door creaked open in the early hours, you didn't hesitate. You got up, fast. Boots echoed across the stone as the lanista entered. He was more than a trainer. He was warden, judge, and God within these walls. He might speak. Often he didn't. His staff did the talking, a sharp jab to the ribs, a brutal kick to the side. Sleep too long, and you'd pay for it. Move too slowly, and you'd be reminded, painfully, that hesitation in the arena meant death. There were no greetings, no small talk, no warm-up stretches. Some men woke up still aching from yesterday's drills. Wooden swords had bruised their backs, cracked their knuckles, split their lips. Others nursed broken ribs, swollen joints, or wounds packed with salt. There was no mercy, no pause. You wrapped your hands with rough cloth, adjusted the worn leather belt around your waist, and prepared to hurt. Training would come. The long hours of drills, of repetition, of screams and sweat. But first came the silence of obedience, the breaking of spirit, the quiet shaping of men into entertainment. In this world, nothing was yours. Not your sleep, not your time, not your name. Even your breath could be taken away with a word, or without one. You weren't being trained to survive. You were being sculpted into a show, into fear, into violence, into a moment of awe for a crowd that would cheer while you bled. And all of that began before the city had even opened its eyes, before a gladiator ever stepped into the Colosseum, before the sand soaked red and the crowd screamed for blood. There was another kind of battle, one fought every single day in the training yard. And while the world remembers the grand arena, what most forget is that the real war the long, slow one, was fought in the dirt behind the walls of the ludus. The training yard was a brutal theater in its own right. At dawn, the gates creaked open, and the gladiators spilled out like shadows. The sun, if it reached them at all, felt more like a spotlight than a blessing. And the dirt, dry, packed, unyielding, wasn't just a floor. It was a testing ground. It would drink your sweat, taste your blood, and record your failures in silence. This wasn't some chaotic brawl. It was painfully structured. The lanista and his assistants oversaw every move like hawks. You didn't get to figure things out in your own time. You followed orders, or you paid for it. Every gladiator trained with the weight of death hanging over him, not in theory, but in truth. One wrong move in the future wouldn't just earn you a bruise, it would be the end. The drills reflected that. Each morning began with weapons training. Wooden swords known as rudis were used not out of kindness, but because they hurt like hell and wouldn't kill. At least, not immediately. You'd start with footwork, endless steps forward and back, lunges, pivots, blocks. A dance designed not to look beautiful but to make your reactions instinctive. A second's hesitation in the arena could be fatal. Out here, it earned you bruises and humiliation. Then came paired sparring. 2 men, face to face, sweat stinging their eyes, ribs still sore from yesterday. No armor, no flare, just gritted teeth and splintered weapons. And when you dropped your guard, when fatigue tricked you into sloppiness, that's when the pain came fast and sharp. You weren't just learning how to fight. You were learning how to hurt, how to endure, how to keep moving even when your lungs burned and your muscles screamed. And around it all, the ever-watchful eyes of your captors. They didn't see men. They saw investments. If you showed potential, maybe you got a bit more bread at dinner. If you didn't, maybe you went to the arena early, to die quickly and be forgotten. Breaks were rare, water was warm and metallic, and food was fuel, not flavor. A thick barley porridge, maybe bread, sometimes bits of meat if you'd earned it. Gladiators needed to be strong, thick, and enduring. Lean didn't last long in the arena. You were fed to be heavy, so the blade had to work harder to find your heart. Then came the mock fights. Not practice, not anymore. These were evaluations. Spars staged in front of nobles or wealthy men looking to place bets on rising stars. These were your first audiences. And if you impressed, they remembered your name. If you bored them, they didn't. And in this world, memory was survival. By midday, your body would be wrecked, bruised, blistered, baked under the Roman sun. But there was no quitting. No tomorrow to try again. The lanista didn't want excuses. He wanted fighters. You weren't just training to perform. You were training to be a product. And when the sun began to sink, when shadows stretched long and the yard finally emptied, you dragged yourself back inside, covered in sweat, dirt, and silence. You knew tomorrow would bring more of the same. The fights weren't in the future. They were already happening, every day. The Colosseum was just the final act, and many gladiators never even made it that far. Morning light in the gladiator barracks wasn't a gentle thing. It didn't slip through linen curtains or warm the floorboards of a peaceful home. It cut through the high slits in stone walls like a blade, casting long, cold lines across the packed dirt floor. You didn't wake slowly. You were already halfway alert. Your body trained to snap into action before you even opened your eyes. There were no dreams worth clinging to. No comfort to coax you into another moment of sleep. Just the stark reminder that every day you woke up was another day closer to the arena. The lanista, your trainer and master, walked the length of the barracks early, boots crunching gravel, his shadow passing like a warning. one sound out of place, one man caught sleeping late or moving slow, and discipline would be swift, often public, always brutal. Some mornings, the lanista carried a rod. Other mornings, a whip. On rare days, a wooden sword used not for teaching but for punishment. Every morning, the message was the same. Your life was not your own, and the price of weakness was pain. Climbing out of your straw-stuffed mat, you'd stretch stiff joints and wipe the sweat of a night spent among dozens of other bodies from your brow. There was no privacy, no quiet, just the rustle of men preparing for another day of brutality. You could smell the tension in the air, sweat, old blood, the sour edge of fear. Some were veterans, scarred, silent, resolved. Others were new, noblemen fallen from grace, slaves bought at market, criminals sentenced to blood, wide eyes, trembling hands. It was easy to spot the ones who wouldn't last the week, and all of you shared one truth. You fought to entertain. You weren't soldiers. You weren't warriors. You were spectacle. Before training, you ate, but not what you'd call breakfast. A bowl of barley mash, gritty and bland. A handful of dried figs if you were lucky. A gulp of watered-down vinegar wine called pasca. It wasn't for taste. It was fuel, barely enough to keep your muscles from cramping halfway through drills. And no one complained. Complaining got you noticed. Getting noticed got you hurt. You learned quickly to keep your head down, to move when told, to speak only when spoken to. Your body wasn't yours anymore, and neither was your voice. Once fed, you filed out into the sun-baked yard where the day's punishments began in earnest. Because make no mistake, training wasn't instruction, it was punishment. Wooden swords weighted heavier than iron to build strength, shields soaked in water to double their heft. You trained on sand not to cushion falls, but to grind into your skin and tear open your feet. You drilled until your arms shook, then you drilled more. If you dropped your sword, you were beaten. If you hesitated in a mock fight, you were beaten. If you flinched, if you blinked, if you breathed wrong, beaten. Every mistake left a mark. Every lesson was carved in bruises and broken bones. The lanista watched with arms crossed, flanked by assistants who took notes, not for your benefit, but to decide how long you'd last. Every slash, every lunge, every block was not just a movement. It was data. A measure of how you'd perform in the arena, how you might die, and how much money your death might be worth. The betting houses relied on accuracy, and the lanista was both trainer and bookmaker. Your value wasn't measured in skill alone, but in entertainment potential. Were you dramatic? Did you bleed well? Did you scream in pain in a way the crowd loved? And yet, for all the cruelty, there was order, structure, the same way a soldier finds rhythm in marching. A gladiator found rhythm in violence. Your body adjusted, your pain dulled. The weight of your sword began to feel familiar in your hand. You started to move without thinking, to strike on instinct, to parry without flinching. And in that rhythm, you started to understand something terrifying. You weren't just training to survive. You were being shaped into something Rome adored, something it cheered for, something it craved. You were becoming a killer, not just for survival, but for sport, a performer in the theater of blood, a nameless god of violence wrapped in sweat and scars, standing one day closer to the roar of the Colosseum, and whatever waited there inside. As the sun climbed higher over the worn sandstone walls of the ludus, its rays casting pale golden streaks across the dusty training grounds, it signaled more than just the start of a new day. For the men who lived, bled, and sometimes died within those walls, it marked the hour of their first proper meal. But forget the grand images from movies. There were no silver platters, no roasted game, and certainly no goblets of wine. Gladiators weren't pampered heroes. They were commodities. Their meals weren't about pleasure. They were about survival. The morning meal was simple, brutally simple. A thick, starchy porridge called pulse was the centerpiece, made from barley or spelt, and often served lukewarm. It was the same most days, monotonous, bland, and utilitarian. Sometimes it was mixed with boiled lentils or soft beans. On rare days, maybe chopped leeks or onions added a trace of flavor. If you were lucky, a drizzle of olive oil or a splash of sour vinegar might appear. But meat? That was a luxury. Sugar? A myth. This wasn't food for feasting. It was fuel, high carb, heavy on legumes, designed to keep a gladiator bulky, not shredded. Despite the Hollywood myth of the ripped, chiseled fighter, many gladiators carried more fat than you'd expect. They needed it. That extra layer could absorb the sting of a glancing sword or the impact of a mace. Muscle was prized, but padding meant survival. The lanista knew this. The doctors did too. You didn't train a racehorse for beauty, you trained it to last. Roman elites mockingly called gladiators hordeari, barley men. The term dripped with contempt. To them, gladiators were brute instruments, fed like oxen and driven into the arena for sport. But inside the barracks, seated shoulder to shoulder on rough wooden benches, gladiators ate with grim focus. They didn't eat in silence out of reverence. They ate in silence because speaking too much could get you a rebuke. Or worse, the lanista was always watching, and if you were seen slacking, extra drills would come. Painful ones. Occasionally, a ludus under the patronage of a wealthy senator or a festival sponsor might enjoy a slight upgrade in rations, perhaps a wedge of goat cheese, a few dried figs, or salted fish. These were treasured like gold, reminders of the world outside, the world that had moved on without them. But those moments were rare. Most mornings were defined by the scrape of spoons in wooden bowls and the low grumble of hungry men. For gladiators, even the simple act of eating came laced with brutal clarity. You ate because you had to. You ate because if your body failed, your life wasn't worth the trouble. No one fed a broken tool. Food wasn't your right. It was an investment someone else had made in you. Fail to repay it in sweat and blood, and that bowl of pulse would vanish. And when it did, so would your chance of survival. Every bite came with the same cold truth. In the arena, the strong lived. The weak were forgotten. Before a gladiator ever stepped into the roaring chaos of the arena, before the bloodthirsty crowd screamed his name or jeered his demise, he had to survive the training. And not just any training. This was a soul-crushing, bone-breaking, mind-eroding ordeal designed to break weak men and mold survivors. The place was called the ludus, a hybrid of prison, barracks, and military-grade torture camp. Overseen by the lanista, usually a retired gladiator who had spilled his share of blood, the ludus was where men were stripped of their past and rebuilt as weapons. The day started before the sun dared rise. A guttural shout or the sudden clatter of metal on stone snapped everyone awake. Sleepy eyes or sluggish limbs earned punishment. There was no tolerance for weakness. The men were marched to the training grounds in silence, each one dragging the weight of their fate behind them. Warm-ups weren't stretches or morning jogs. They were grueling full-body tests. Gladiators hauled massive stones across the yard, dragged weighted sleds through dirt, and swung wooden swords so heavy their muscles screamed after each arc. These were no ceremonial rituals. The pain was the point. If you couldn't handle this, you had no business living long enough to fight. Each man trained in the art of his assigned style, which was more fate than choice. A murmillo, equipped with a heavy gladius and rectangular shield, repeated block and strike drills until his arms felt like lead. The rotarius, a lightly armored net fighter with a trident, honed the precise, deadly timing of ensnaring and stabbing while avoiding being hacked to pieces. The secutor, designed to counter the retiarius, drilled relentlessly on pursuit aggression, and cornering techniques taught to press the attack with unrelenting force. The training weapons were wood, but they weren't toys, often heavier than their metal counterparts. They bruised skin, cracked ribs, and shattered egos. The instructors were as harsh as the regimen. Whips, canes, or the flat of a practice sword were tools of correction. Slip in footwork, crack, miss a block, thud, show fear, pain. Each mistake was punished swiftly, the lesson burned into muscle memory through agony. Foot placement was as crucial as breath. A single misstep in combat could end with a blade in the throat. Better to learn through pain now than die later. But not everything was about brute force. Discipline was drilled into them. Gladiators were conditioned to suppress fear and master rage, to keep their emotions in check even when the stakes were life and death. Performance mattered just as much as victory. They were coached on how to fight with flair, when to raise their arms to the crowd, how to make a kill look dramatic. A well-acted death could win a crowd's pity, just as a flashy blow could draw their admiration. Every fight was a play, and every man was both actor and blade. Training ended around midday, though ending was a relative term. Bodies were sore, some bloodied. Then came the meal, essential for strength. Gladiators didn't feast, but their diet was strategic. Heavy on barley, legumes, and carbs, it was meant to bulk them up and give them a layer of fat to absorb impact. They were nicknamed hordiari, barley men, not out of mockery, but acknowledgement. The food was plain, but it fueled the machine. Afternoons were quieter, but not restful. Some practiced solo drills, others received medical attention, and many simply tried to rest their aching bodies, yet no one truly relaxed. The arena was always coming. Every ache in their bones was a reminder. Soon they'd stand in the sand, staring down death with a weapon in their hand and the world watching. There were no breaks in the ludus, no weekends, no reprieve, just repetition, exhaustion, and the cold certainty that every day brought them closer to a gate opening, and the possibility that it might never close behind them again. Sleep now, if you like, because what follows is the slow, dusty crawl of a day most would rather forget, the day a Roman gladiator steps into the jaws of fate. And no, it doesn't begin with roaring crowds or flashing steel. It begins far earlier than that, in the cold, echoing silence of dawn, where the true weight of survival starts to settle like iron on your chest. The first pale light creeps through the barred windows of the ludus, the gladiator training ground. Before the sun has a chance to burn the sand, you're already sitting up, not from the grace of sleep, but from the slow boil of nerves that kept you half awake through the night. The kind of nerves that twist deep in your gut, like a rope pulled too tight. This isn't another day of drills. This isn't wooden swords or padded shields. Today, you step into the real thing. Today, you face steel for blood. You dress slowly, methodically, not from vanity, but because each piece of armor feels heavier, more significant than ever before. The helmet, the greaves, the manica on your sword arm. These aren't just tools now. They're the last thin line between you and the end. You tighten every strap a little more, adjust every buckle until it's just right. It has to be. And then you wait. There is no hurry. You do not get to choose the moment you enter the arena. That's for others to decide. So you wait in silence or in company, depending on your fate that day. The holding pen beneath the arena is dark and cramped, the kind of place where thoughts become loud. Overhead, the muffled roar of the crowd rolls through the stone, a distant, inhuman thunder. They haven't come for you, not personally, not for your survival. They've come for blood, for spectacle, for the sound of blades and the silence that follows. You might pray, if you still believe. Or maybe you just spit on the ground and try to steady your breath. Others nearby are doing the same in their own ways. Some sit quietly. Some mumble to themselves. Some sharpen blades they've already sharpened 3 times. These men are not always enemies. You might have trained beside one of them for months, learned his rhythm, his jokes, even his regrets. But now, that doesn't matter. Brotherhood ends the moment your names are called. And then, it happens. A heavy wooden door groans open on rusted hinges. Light spills in. The air changes. You smell it instantly. Sweat, dust, oil, blood, and something sharper, something electric. The anticipation of 1,000 eyes, hungry for violence. The sand feels warm under your feet, soft yet gritty, like the final surface of every fight. You step into the blinding light and the deafening roar of a crowd that does not know your name. Most never will. To them, you're not a man. You're a figure in armor, a role in a play. There might be an announcer, reading out names with exaggerated flair. There might be music or fanfare. But for you, it all fades. All that matters now is the person standing across from you, your opponent. Maybe he's nervous too, but you can't tell. His helmet hides everything but the eyes, and even those might be lying. There's no bell, no horn, no dramatic cue. Just a signal, a nod, a hand gesture, and the air thickens instantly. Suddenly the world shrinks to the distance between you and the man who might end your life. You move, he moves, the crowd vanishes. It's just your breath, your blade, his. The fight is not graceful. It is not elegant or theatrical the way they like to paint it in mosaics. It's messy, brutal, loud, clumsy in moments. Blades scrape armor, shields slam into ribs. You grunt, you stumble. Blood doesn't gush like in the stories. It seeps, it slicks, it stains. It can come from anywhere. A gash, a bruise, or the friction of leather against skin over hours of movement. Then, a mistake, a chance, an opening. You strike, or he does. You fall, or he does. Maybe you both stagger. Maybe your weapon breaks. Maybe it ends in a single move. Or maybe it drags into the dust and sweat of minutes you can barely track. There's no room for hesitation. There is only instinct. If you survive, if you're lucky and precise and strong enough, then comes the stillness. A breath, a heartbeat, and you wait. Not to be praised, but to be judged. The emperor, or the editor of the games, raises a hand. The crowd might shout for mercy or death. You don't know which until the signal is clear. A thumb, a turn of the wrist. And even then, the executioner might have the final word. But we won't go there yet. Not while the dust still dances in the air. Not while your heart is still pounding and your limbs still obey. Not while the story hasn't chosen an ending. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Because, once more, the sand is stained. And for now, sleep might be the only refuge from the weight of what you've just seen, or lived through. Before a gladiator ever stepped into the roar of the arena, he had to endure something far more grueling and thankless: training. This wasn't the stuff of legend. No glory, no cheering crowds, no golden light shining through dust and blood. Just sweat, pain, and monotony. Forget any romantic ideas of swordplay and honor. This was repetition and suffering under the relentless Roman sun. Days started before the first rays of dawn, and didn't end until every muscle burned. The ludus, or gladiator school, wasn't a place of learning. It was a prison, a crucible, and a factory all at once. It was run by a lanista, usually a retired gladiator or a cold-blooded businessman who saw his men not as students but as assets. Costly ones. Gladiators were investments, bought, trained, fed, and maintained. The goal wasn't to pamper them. The goal was to keep them alive long enough to profit from their death. At daybreak, the drills began. not with sharp steel, but with heavy wooden swords, rudies. They were never meant to kill in practice. Instead, they would line up in long rows in open sand pits, each facing a palace, a tall wooden post driven into the ground. And then they struck, again and again and again. Hundreds of swings with precision, with discipline, with fury. They practiced like machines. It wasn't about looking impressive. It was about building stamina and carving form into muscle memory. Sloppiness? Not tolerated. Lose focus for a second, and a staff would crash against your back. Trainers weren't coaches. They were drill masters, often sadistic and always uncompromising. Mercy was not part of the curriculum. The greatest offense wasn't making a mistake. It was giving less than your full strength. Because in the arena, anything less than total effort meant a blade in your gut. After drills came conditioning. Grueling, soul-breaking conditioning. Laps around the yard, in full armor under the heat, dragging heavy weights through sand, lifting stones, pushing carts uphill, wrestling until limbs refused to obey. They didn't just train to fight. They trained to survive, to outlast, to absorb punishment and keep moving. A gladiator wasn't just expected to deal out pain. He had to endure it, take hits, real hits. If you cried out or flinched, the others noticed, the trainers noticed. And once you were marked as weak, it stuck. Weakness was a scent in the air, and in this brutal world, it invited vultures. The food was utilitarian, nothing fancy. Meals consisted mainly of beans, barley, and coarse bread. A vegetarian diet might seem strange for warriors, but it made sense. It was cheap, calorie-dense, and effective. These men weren't sculpted like marble statues. They were bulky, layered in fat that acted as a kind of armor. The crowd loved blood, but promoters preferred blood that didn't lead to quick death. A thick body bled more slowly, protected the vital organs, and extended the fight. Gladiators were nicknamed hordearii, barley men, not out of ridicule, but because that grain fueled their violence. Evenings were no relief. That's when sparring began. And sparring wasn't for show. It was organized chaos, matched by skill level, not sympathy. There were no easy pairings. Mistakes brought bruises, dislocations, concussions. But pain in practice meant less pain in combat. If you fell in the sand during training, you got back up. If you fell in the arena, you might not. Every movement was hammered into the nervous system. Blocks, counters, footwork, stances, all drilled until there was no thought, only instinct. And still, the shadow of death lingered. You could be perfect and still die. But skip training, slack off, complain, and your death was guaranteed. When the stars finally rose and the sand cooled, the men hobbled back to the barracks. Some walked, some limped, others leaned on comrades. They collapsed into straw bedding with splintered muscles and burning joints. There was no comfort here, just exhaustion. Sleep came quick and dreamless, and in the quiet, every man knew. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Because in this life, training wasn't preparation, it was survival. And the only thing more certain than another sunrise was the fight waiting beyond it. By the time the sun reached its peak, casting sharp golden light through the narrow windows of the ludus, the entire gladiator training school seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just another day of bruises and drills. This was a fight day. And fight days changed everything. For a gladiator, the day of a bout was unlike any other. There was no shouting from the trainers, no clatter of wooden swords against shields, no harsh words to correct a weak stance. Instead, there was a heavy, tense silence. Even the usual morning clamor, the grunts of early drills, the clink of armor, the tightening of sandals, felt hushed. reverent, almost funereal. It was as if the walls of the ludus themselves understood what was about to unfold. Today, the chosen man was a murmillo named Gaius. He was just 22, with a scar carved along his jawline from his first real match, a brutal reminder that the arena never played fair. He sat apart from the others, calm, focused, his eyes tracing the dirt floor as if reading some silent scripture. Next to him, an older slave, his personal armorer and a man who had dressed countless others for their final walks, moved with practiced care. There were no words between them, only the methodical sound of leather straps being pulled tight, of buckles being fastened, of armor settling into place. Piece by piece, the transformation began. First, the thick sublegaculum, wrapped tightly around his waist and thighs. Then the cingulum, a wide padded belt designed to protect his midsection and hold the weight of his gear. Next came the greaves for his shins, and the manica, the segmented sleeve of hardened leather and bronze that covered his sword arm. Finally, the imposing murmillo helmet with its high crest and gridded visor was placed over his head. The moment it enclosed his face, the outside world faded to muffled echoes and narrow vision. The other men in the ludus kept their distance. Some turned away, pretending to polish their weapons or tighten their straps. Others offered quiet nods or murmured words under their breath, half prayer, half farewell. No one cried. Not here. This was Rome. This was the code. Everyone knew what this day could mean. Death, certainly, but also, if luck and skill aligned, the start of something bigger. Glory, rewards, favor from the crowd. A good kill could earn a laurel wreath, a silver coin, even the attention of a noble patron. And if a man strung together enough victories, he might one day be handed the rudis, the wooden sword of freedom. When the signal came, Gaius rose and joined the others, marching in the day's procession. Together they filed out from the gates of the ludus into the blinding Roman sunlight. Horn players led the way, their brassy notes slicing through the morning air. Curious onlookers, both children and adults, crowded the streets to catch a glimpse of the fighters. Gladiators didn't just appear at the arena. They were paraded like champions or sacrificial animals, symbols of Rome's brutal beauty. As they approached the amphitheater, the noise began to swell. The murmur of the crowd grew into a living, breathing creature, loud, impatient, hungry. Inside, the stone walls vibrated with cheers, chants, and laughter. This was entertainment, a theater of flesh and blood. Senators, magistrates, merchants, farmers, every class of Romans sat shoulder to shoulder, united in their desire to watch men face death with grace or fury. The emperor himself might be present, lounging beneath a canopy, surrounded by advisors and sipping wine. Gaius stepped through the gates and onto the sand, and everything else vanished. The crowd, the banners, the music, even the sun faded into the background. All that remained was the arena, the curved wall around him, the weapons laid out, the opponent at the far end, and the silence within. He could feel the heat rising from the sand, soaking into his soles. Sweat dripped into his eyes beneath the helmet. The sword in his hand felt heavier than in training. The armor pulled at his shoulders like a second skin of fear. His opponent, another murmillo, was just as still. Across the arena, they mirrored each other like reflections in a pool just before a stone breaks the surface. Neither moved. Neither spoke. This was the moment that separated the trained from the legends. The crowd hadn't screamed yet. The officials hadn't raised their hands. The signal hadn't been given. But this breath before the clash, this heartbeat before steel met flesh, was the moment every gladiator lived for or died in. This was the calm before the roar. This was the silence before history remembered, or forgot, you. Before a gladiator ever stepped into the Colosseum, before the roar of the crowd or the clash of steel, there was the grind. Grueling, relentless, repetitive, brutal in its simplicity, and devastating in its effect. Every morning, rain or shine, Gladiators were jolted from sleep before the sun had even risen. There were no gentle wake-ups, no breakfasts in bed, only barked commands and, if you moved too slowly, the sharp sting of a trainer's cane across your back. The day's goal was singular: to shape you into a living weapon, or break you trying. The training grounds were called the ludus. If you were unlucky, or perhaps lucky depending on your perspective, enough to be selected for one of the elite Roman gladiator schools, you would live, eat, train, and possibly die within its walls. The most infamous of these was the Ludus Magnus, situated right next to the Colosseum. It wasn't just a school, it was a production facility. What it produced wasn't education, but entertainment. A deadly, high-stakes performance honed through pain and repetition. Your body was their canvas, and the artwork was violence. Training wasn't casual, and it wasn't optional. It was relentless and punishing. You didn't merely spar, you drilled endlessly. Sword drills to train precision, shield drills to train defense, footwork to keep you alive, balance to keep you standing, endurance so you could outlast your opponent when everything else failed. For hours each day you'd strike at a wooden post called a pugilar with a wooden sword that was purposely heavier than the real thing. Each swing tore your muscles, each missed step earned you pain. When your arms trembled and your breath faltered, the trainers, ex-gladiators, scarred and hardened, pushed you harder. Sympathy had no place in the arena. Fighters trained in specific combat styles assigned to them. A Thraex trained with a curved blade and a small, nimble shield. A Murmillo wore heavy armor, wielding a massive rectangular shield in Gladius. A Retiarius, the most unconventional, learned to fight with a net and trident, relying on speed and deception to overcome better armored foes. These matchups weren't random. They were designed for drama. Style against style. Strength versus speed. Reach against maneuverability. Every duel was a human chess match with blood on the board. Training didn't stop at the body. There were lessons in strategy, Roman legends, and crowd manipulation. You learned how to win favor from the audience, how to sell the illusion of struggle, how to fall dramatically, how to die with dignity. A well-acted death could earn more cheers than a sloppy victory. Because while most gladiators were nameless, dying well might win you fame, a rare currency in a life defined by ownership. Your diet? Carefully engineered. Mostly plant-based. High in carbohydrates, low in meat. Thick barley porridge, beans, grains. What modern sports scientists might call a bulking diet. Not for performance, but for resilience. It made you heavier, which made you bleed less. It also gave your owners a better chance of patching you up if you lived through a match. You weren't just a fighter, you were an investment. And they maintained you accordingly. Some men chose this life. Volunteers chasing fame, money, or redemption from debt. But most did not. Slaves, criminals, prisoners of war. They had no say. Their lives were reduced to a routine of violence. No matter how you ended up inside the ludus, your future depended on your ability to endure, to fight, to impress, and ultimately to survive. As the Roman sun crept higher, the training grounds echoed with the rhythm of preparation. Wooden swords whistled through the air. Sand crunched beneath sandals. Bodies slammed into the dirt. Sweat dripped. Muscles strained. Pain was constant. But so was the purpose. This wasn't just practice. It was rehearsal for death. A slow, methodical march toward a stage where one misstep could mean the end. Where entertainment and execution were one and the same. The sun had barely begun its climb over the rooftops of Rome when the great iron gates of the arena groaned open. The sand, still cool and damp from the night air, stretched out like a canvas waiting to be painted with sweat, blood, and desperation. This wasn't the moment of glory yet. This was the beginning of the ritual. This was the moment before thunder, the calm before the storm, the sacred preparation. Gladiators called the arena many things: the proving ground, the mouth of death, the belly of the beast. but whatever the name, they all knew what it meant. To enter was to gamble everything. Stone walls, ancient and worn, absorbed the weight of memory. The cries of the condemned, the roar of triumph, the gasping silence of defeat. Iron grates below whispered with the uneasy shuffle of wild animals being led to their holding pens, their claws clicking against the stone like skeletal drums. Slaves scurried across the sand, hauling buckets of water to wet the ground, tamping down the dust so it wouldn't rise and choke the view. Every movement here was clockwork, trained, rehearsed, perfected. It was theater, yes, but it was also war. Beneath the arena, in the dim holding cells lit only by flickering oil lamps, the gladiators sat in silence. They didn't speak because there was nothing left to say. The time for talk was gone. They had already oiled their muscles, checked their armor, sharpened their blades. They'd rehearsed their moves until they could fight in their sleep. Their minds were now tightened, coiled, like the tension in a drawn bow. This silence wasn't fear. It was ritual, discipline, reverence. It was the silence of men and women who had stared into the eyes of death before, and who knew they might do so again before the sun reached its zenith. Some would die today. Everyone understood this. No amount of prayer or bravado would change it. Death was not an intruder here. It was part of the show. It wore no mask, bore no shame. And yet there was no panic. The arena didn't want panic. It wanted focus, precision, poise. Trainers moved through the corridors, nodding to their fighters, offering a last piece of advice or a stern glance that said more than words. Armorers checked every strap, every buckle, testing shields for looseness, adjusting helmets for fit. They moved like surgeons in a war hospital, treating not wounds, but the equipment that could prevent them. Above ground, the city was waking. Vendors called out as they arranged their stalls, the smell of baking bread mingling with roasted meat and acrid wine. Children darted through the crowd, shouting the names of their favorite fighters, practicing their own battle cries. The streets swelled with people, patricians in fine linen, merchants with jangling purses, beggars eager for dropped coins, slaves hoping to glimpse a legend. All drawn to the spectacle, all eager for blood. In the gossip of the crowd, names rose like battle standards. Scorpus, deadly with the trident and net. Magnus, the juggernaut who had yet to taste defeat. Cassia, the rare and ferocious woman whose blade had earned her grudging respect from even the most hardened senators. They weren't just gladiators. They were stories made flesh, and the people hungered for the next chapter. Soon the stands would fill with thousands. Trumpets would blare. The emperor might raise his hand in approval. The gates would groan once more, and the sand, once cool and clean, would run warm and red before the sun reached its peak. But that was still to come. For now, the arena slept with one eye open. It was morning. It was breath held in the chest of the city. It was stillness before the scream, still quiet, still waiting. By the time a gladiator stepped into the arena, he wasn't just a fighter. He was a performer, an actor, in one of the bloodiest stages history has ever known. The Colosseum was no casual backdrop. It was a thunderous cauldron of noise, violence, ritual, and spectacle, built not only of stone but of expectation and myth. Tens of thousands of Romans crammed into its steep marble terraces, sweating under the relentless sun, sipping cheap wine, tearing apart loaves of bread, and shouting themselves hoarse for a glimpse of steel clashing with flesh. From elite senators in pristine togas to loud-mouthed plebeians in sweat-stained tunics, the audience came with a single hunger: to be entertained. And when a gladiator's sandaled foot stepped onto that blood-soaked stage, every voice quieted for just a beat before erupting again. Every eye fixed on him, every cheer or jeer could be his last. The sun blazed highest when the real action began. Early morning hours belonged to the warm-up acts, gruesome beast hunts with imported lions and panthers, executions of criminals often staged as reenactments of myths, or mock naval battles when the arena floor was flooded. But by midday, the temperature and the crowd boiled over. This was the moment the crowd waited for. The trumpet blared, drums pounded, and the announcer's voice rang out over the noise, declaring the combatants. Gladiators emerged from opposing gates like shadows stepping into firelight, armored, armed, and ready. Not for a war they believed in, but for a spectacle they had trained endlessly to survive. Every twitch of a sword, every duck of a helmet, every calculated strike, it all played into the theater of death. For the gladiators themselves, the arena was both stage and battlefield, a place of adrenaline-soaked clarity and bone-deep terror. Some men crumbled beneath the crush of tens of thousands of stares. Others ignited like dry straw in flame, their senses sharpened by the crowd's energy. Before the first blow, they raised weapons in salute, either to the emperor himself, if present, or to the editor who sponsored the games. The famous phrase, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you, wasn't spoken universally nor always sincerely, but it underscored the fatal stakes. Death wasn't a possibility. It was a promise. And the crowd, they weren't there to watch. They were there to participate. They screamed encouragement, laughed at hesitation, and cursed displays of fear. A fighter who showed courage and skill could win their adoration, their chants echoing through the stone rafters. But cowardice, or just poor showmanship, could draw mockery, or worse. The audience sometimes played jury. When a gladiator was beaten, disarmed, or too wounded to continue, he could raise a finger in submission, asking for mercy. The editor would glance to the audience for a verdict. Contrary to modern myth, a thumbs up might signal death. A turn of the thumb or a gesture with a closed fist could mean life. It varied from region to region, and no gladiator ever knew for sure which way the wind would blow. Not all matches ended in death. Some concluded in exhaustion, in mutual respect between fighters, or in mercy granted by the crowd. A well-fought battle, one that told a story that kept spectators on edge, was often more valuable than a quick, blood-soaked kill. Gladiators with fame, with names the crowd recognized, were rarely sacrificed easily. These were investments. Some were adored like modern sports stars. People bet fortunes on their victories, painted their names on walls, and bought tiny figurines of their likeness. When they triumphed, the noise in the Colosseum could rival a thunderclap. They were awarded palm branches as symbols of victory, cash prizes, and sometimes even golden necklaces. Their wounds were treated carefully, their reputations expanded, and on rare, glorious occasions a wooden sword, called a rudis, might be awarded. That was the symbol of freedom. But on the blazing floor of the Colosseum, freedom was a mirage. No amount of victory guaranteed survival. Every fight was another chance to rise, or to bleed out in the sand. The roar of the crowd was constant. The sun showed no mercy. The sand swallowed blood like it was born for it. And through it all, the gladiator stood, breathing hard, heart pounding, knowing he'd survived another round, another demand for violence, another day beneath the brutal gaze of Rome. The roar doesn't just hit. It crashes down like a tidal wave. You've heard it before, filtered through stone corridors, softened by distance, like the low grumble of distant thunder. But here, now, with nothing but a wooden gate between you and the open sky, it's overwhelming. The sound swells and pulses with a life of its own. Tens of thousands of Romans packed into marble seats, their voices combining into something primal. It's not just noise, it's demand, it's lust, it's blood hunger. You try to steady your breath, but your chest is vibrating from the sheer force of it all. You can feel the sound in your ribs, in your arms, in the soles of your feet. Somewhere out there, hawkers shout over the chaos, pushing wine and bread and honeyed nuts. Horns blare, drums hammer, and the whole Colosseum seems to throb with anticipation. This place isn't just awake, it's possessed. The arena is a beast, and you are about to step into its belly. Your armor clinks as you adjust your stance. The plates are polished, yes, but scuffed and dented from weeks of training and punishment. The sunlight gleams off the curved edges, momentarily blinding. Your gladius, short, brutal, and forged for one purpose, feels heavier than ever in your grip. It's no practice blade. There are no blunted tips or instructors watching from a shaded portico. Just you, your shield, and whatever comes out of that gate across the sand. Around you, your fellow gladiators prepare in their own ways. Some mumble quick, frantic prayers to Mithras, Mars, or forgotten gods of their homeland. Others pace like restless wolves, muscles tense, breath sharp. A few close their eyes as if to vanish into themselves, finding calm in the storm. You say nothing. You just listen. Listen to the groan of wooden gears as the portcullis prepares to lift. Listen to the shuffling sand underfoot. Listen to your own heart, pounding like a battle drum beneath your ribs. A young slave appears at the side, lips trembling, eyes darting. He gives the signal, just a nod, almost imperceptible. But that's all it takes. Every instinct tightens. You shift your grip on the sword. Your mouth is dry. You have no idea what lies ahead. It might be another man, or many. It might be a lion, a bear, or worse. Sometimes they recreate entire battles, chaos choreographed with real blood and screams. It doesn't matter. You have no say. You never did. The gate creaks, wood groans, light pours in like a flood. You step forward, cautious at first. The world outside is blinding. The heat smacks you full in the face, the midday sun merciless and absolute. You blink, squint, and the outline of the arena takes shape. Endless rows of stone benches curving around like the ribs of some ancient god rising high, stuffed with spectators. They chant, they jeer, they chant again. The words blend together, a tide of noise crashing down from every side. You take your place on the sand, warm, golden, coarse beneath your sandals. The scent of sweat, blood, dust, and roasted meat hangs in the air. You can feel the tension from the crowd pressing down like a physical weight. Somewhere above, a magistrate in purple robes signals to begin. You can't hear him. You don't need to. You adjust your stance, raise your shield, and hold your sword at the ready. The gates across the arena begin to open. This is your moment. This is your truth. This is what it means to be a gladiator. Not just to fight, but to perform. To bleed with grace. To kill with style. To survive not just with strength, but with spectacle. The crowd doesn't care who you are. They care what you give them. You breathe in. You exhale slowly. And then you move forward, alone, into the fire. You are no longer a man. You are a show, a weapon, a prayer answered in violence. You are a gladiator, and the beast is watching. For the Roman gladiator, the fight didn't end when the crowd roared or when the sand darkened beneath spilled blood. In many ways, it was what came after the spectacle that revealed the deepest cost of the profession. Victory did not guarantee safety. Survival did not promise healing. Every match left its mark, not just in the tally of victories, but in the very flesh and memory of the fighter. Part 13 pulls back the curtain on a brutal, often ignored chapter of gladiator life. The slow, painful toll of injuries, the struggle to recover, and the quiet endurance of a body shattered and rebuilt again and again by violence. Injuries were not occasional setbacks. They were constant companions, cracked ribs, broken jaws, dislocated shoulders, severed tendons, puncture wounds from tridents, slicing cuts from short swords, crushing blows from blunt instruments. The human body, no matter how honed or hardened, was not made to endure repeated punishment of this magnitude. Even in matches that were carefully staged or refereed to avoid death, pain was inevitable. The damage was real, and it compounded with every fight. After a bout, wounded fighters were hauled or carried back to the barracks or to a makeshift infirmary, if they were lucky enough to be conscious. There, a team of medici, Roman physicians assigned to the ludus, would begin the painful process of treatment. These were not battlefield surgeons or learned healers of the elite. Most had only basic training passed down from other medici, and they worked with whatever tools they had: hooks, probes, bandages, and brute patience. Wine served as disinfectant. Honey was used to fight infection. Herbal concoctions, some numbing, others more spiritual than medical, were applied to soothe or sedate. Sometimes these methods worked. Often, infection came anyway, spreading through the bloodstream before anyone could intervene. Many died days after the match, not from wounds, but from the rot that followed. Scars became the storybook of a gladiator's life. Each mark, burn, and indentation told of battles survived. A thick scar across the shoulder might mean a duel with a murmillo. A puncture wound near the ribs, perhaps a fight against a retiarius. A flattened nose or deep ridge in the skull might come from repeated blunt trauma. A hammer, a club, a fall. Some gladiators bore these marks with pride. They were badges of honor. For others, they were liabilities. Too many old injuries could label a man as past his prime, a bad bet in the eyes of the lanista or gamblers. In an industry fueled by blood and spectacle, being too broken could mean being discarded. And what if a gladiator could no longer fight? What if the injuries were too severe? The pain too constant? Then began the second chapter, the life of a retired gladiator, if they were fortunate enough to see it. Some were granted their freedom, known as erudis, and went on to become instructors, training the next generation in the art of war. Others, still owned by the ludus, were assigned less glorious roles, overseeing the stables, managing the armory, cooking for the school, or helping with the care and conditioning of beasts brought in for the arena. Retirement was not peace. It was simply survival in another form. Few lived into true old age. Fewer still lived without daily pain. But for those still fit to fight, still able to rise in the morning and tighten their armor, the injuries were simply part of the cost. Another opponent to overcome. Each sunrise brought a test. Could they move, swing, block, and breathe without agony? Most couldn't, but they fought anyway. Every bandaged hand that gripped a sword, every limp that carried a man into the arena. These were not signs of weakness. They were proof of endurance. Because in the life of a gladiator, survival did not mean healing. It simply meant living long enough to fight again. Not every gladiator died in the arena. Some, through a mix of skill, resilience, political favor, and sheer luck, managed to survive match after match, earning a kind of grim celebrity. But even for those who lived to see the end of their fighting days, life after the arena was anything but peaceful or assured. So what happened once the roar of the crowd faded, the blood dried, and the sand was swept clean? What lay beyond the Colosseum gates for a man who had stared down death again and again? For many gladiators who earned their freedom, there was no home to return to, because for most, there never had been one. They were usually enslaved as children, captured as prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Their identities had been erased or warped into that of a combatant. The rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing manumission, was a coveted object. It marked the moment a gladiator was granted his freedom by the editor of the games, often due to years of survival or an extraordinary display of courage. But even with this symbolic release, the question remained: freedom to do what? Go where? With no property, no citizenship, and no true status in Roman society, many of these newly freed men drifted in a kind of limbo. Some found work as bodyguards for wealthy Romans, their fighting prowess now serving private security rather than public spectacle. Others remained tied to the arena world, training new recruits or traveling from town to town offering exhibitions, paid spars where crowds could relive the thrill of the arena through a faded veteran. These men became living relics, flesh and bone souvenirs of Rome's obsession with bloodsport. Physically, however, these men were shadows of themselves. Their bodies bore the cumulative toll of years spent fighting for survival. They were often scarred beyond recognition. Faces smashed, noses twisted or flattened, fingers missing, joints stiffened or shattered, spines misaligned. Many suffered from lingering infections, chronic pain, and psychological trauma. Some had been stabbed in the same place so many times, the scar tissue created strange knots beneath their skin. Limps, cloudy vision, disfigurements. These were not exceptions, but the rule. In the ludus, medical care was pragmatic. Patch you up enough to get you back on your feet. Good enough to fight again. There was no thought to long-term wellness. The Roman world wasn't designed with retirement in mind for its human weapons. And yet, here's where the story turns odd. Gladiators were also enveloped in layers of deep superstition and myth. The Romans were obsessed with omens and fate, and gladiators, as men who flirted constantly with death, were thought to carry a kind of spiritual residue. Their sweat was believed to hold curative powers. Wealthy women would pay to have it collected, dabbing it on their skin like sacred oil. Gladiator blood was considered magical, an aphrodisiac, a fertility charm, even a remedy for epilepsy. Some believed consuming the blood of a fallen fighter transferred strength and vitality. In that bizarre intersection of brutality and belief, surviving the arena made you more than a man. It made you a living talisman. This strange form of fame, however, was fleeting. Despite the morbid admiration, most ex-gladiators faded into obscurity. Their bodies, so visibly broken, were often too damaged for any kind of sustained labor. Their identities, so closely tied to violence, made integration into civilian life nearly impossible. Rome cheered them in the sand, but seldom honored them beyond it. For all the sweat and blood spilled to entertain the masses, there were no pensions, no monuments, no true rewards. To be a gladiator was to burn hot and fast, to be consumed by the same people who once screamed your name. So when we think of gladiators, we tend to focus on the roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the theatrics of combat. But the quieter aftermath, the bruised silence, the slow fade into poverty, pain, and obscurity, that was often the real battle. And in a society that glorified victory and strength above all, the moment you stopped being useful, you were forgotten. Because survival in the arena didn't guarantee a future. It only meant you lived long enough to be haunted by everything it took to get there. Fighting in the arena wasn't just brutal. It was physically catastrophic. Bones snapped, muscles tore, wounds festered, flesh shredded, nerves were damaged, and joints locked up after taking too many blows. And yet, despite all of it, gladiators couldn't afford to fall apart. They weren't seen as human beings. They were investments, living property, breathing entertainment. So behind the roaring crowds, the splatter of blood, and the clang of weapons, there existed a quieter, crucial figure in every gladiator school, the medicus. Think of him as the ancient world sports doctor, battlefield surgeon, pain manager, and therapist all rolled into one, working in shadow while others sought glory in sunlight. A good medicus could mean the difference between a swift return to the arena or a slow, miserable death from infection. And the job wasn't easy. He wasn't working with antibiotics, modern tools, or anesthesia. There were no sterile rooms, no morphine drips, no surgical gloves. Instead, he had wine to disinfect wounds, honey to coat open cuts and prevent rot, and crude mixtures of herbs, vinegar, or even ground-up metals to use as makeshift antiseptics. Surgery was done while the patient was fully conscious, often biting down on a strip of leather or stick. Dislocated joints were yanked back into place with brute strength. Arrows were dug out with iron forceps that seared more than they soothed. Broken bones were reset using wooden splints and linen soaked in resin or egg whites, then bound tightly to encourage stiffness and healing. Gladiators bore this pain in silence. Complaining didn't earn you sympathy. It earned you shame and possibly less effort from the medicus, who had a queue of broken men to tend to. Some of the best medici didn't work for senators or freeborn citizens. No, they worked behind the walls of the ludus, tending to men who lived by the sword and bled for a crowd's amusement. In this twisted economy, a healthy fighter meant potential profit. A school with a skilled medicus had higher survival rates, which in turn made it more attractive to trainers, investors, and wealthy patrons. Healing wasn't just about kindness or ethics. It was about business. Fighters too injured to compete again might still be patched up just enough to be sold to labor camps or sent to the mines. And others, stitched back together by crude hands and tools, were back training within weeks, tendons barely recovered, bruises still blooming, their pain stitched into their skin like thread into leather. And while you might think a healed wound was a blessing, it often came with strings attached. Treatment wasn't free. The cost of every bandage, every herb, every hour spent sewing your flesh back into shape was often added to the gladiator's debt. The lanista kept the tally. Getting injured didn't just hurt. It put you deeper into the pit. The pain stuck around, but so did the bill. You owed them not only your next fight, but the one after that, and maybe the one after that too. Still, for many gladiators, the medicus was the closest thing they had to compassion. They didn't trust their lanistas, the men who yelled, whipped, and gambled with their lives. But the medicus? He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate you in front of the others. He sewed you up, handed you bitter herbs to help you sleep, wrapped your limbs, cleaned your wounds. Maybe, if he wasn't too tired, he whispered a prayer to Apollo or Asclepius. In a life governed by violence and owned by others, the medicus was a rare figure of care. Cold, clinical, efficient care, but care nonetheless. A surgeon with a scarred soul and stained hands who could not afford to mourn the men he failed to save. So the next time you picture a gladiator rising from the arena floor, bloodied but alive, don't stop at the cheers. Don't end the story with the applause. Instead, follow him. Watch him limp down a stone hallway, past the cells and the chains, into a cold room lit by oil lamps. There, the medicus waits. Not with congratulations, but with a needle, a scalpel, and a bowl of wine. Not to toast victory, but to start sewing the fighter back together before the next match tears him apart again. By now, our gladiator has survived the grueling drills of the ludus, endured countless bruising sparring matches, and earned the right to step into the sand of the grand amphitheater. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare him for the overwhelming blast of sound that greeted him on game day. The Colosseum, that colossal stone arena at the heart of Rome, swelled with the energy of nearly 50,000 spectators. Senators draped in togas lounged in the shaded marble tiers. Merchants in colorful tunics passed wine and gossip, and commoners packed the stands, hungry for blood and spectacle. Even the emperor might be in attendance, his presence casting a long shadow over every outcome. The atmosphere was charged, crackling with anticipation. The air smelled of roasted meat, oil, sweat, and spilled wine, and it vibrated with the din of thousands shouting, laughing, and singing. But the crowd wasn't just watching. They were part of the show. They bet on fighters like gamblers at a racetrack. They jeered at the unworthy and roared for their favorites. Some came to witness the display of skill, others for the raw violence. For some it was theater, for others justice, and for many it was simply sport. A gladiator could ascend to the status of folk hero, or fall into obscurity based on the crowd's mood. Trumpets blared from high above. The heavy bronze gates groaned open. Sand shimmered beneath the sun like a golden sea. The fighters emerged, armor gleaming, muscles tensed, nerves coiled tight beneath their helmets and gear. Our gladiator stepped forward, his heart pounding so loud it almost drowned out the noise. Almost. Around him the Colosseum's roar surged like a storm tide. Some spectators screamed his name, others spat insults, but all eyes, tens of thousands of eyes, were fixed on him. What many people forget is that the audience wielded real power. This wasn't just passive entertainment. If a gladiator fell and raised his finger in submission, it was not merely the editor of the games who decided his fate. Often, the editor turned to the crowd. They waved handkerchiefs or thrust their thumbs, signals of mercy or death. A warrior who had fought valiantly might earn a reprieve. A coward, or one who bored the crowd, might find no mercy waiting. For our gladiator, every heartbeat was a gamble, every blow a performance. He wasn't just fighting his opponent, he was dancing for the mob, feeding their appetite with blood and bravery. The Colosseum wasn't merely an arena, it was a living, breathing entity, a beast built of stone, voices, and judgment. And today, it would decide whether he walked out a victor, a legend, or a corpse. For a Roman gladiator, death wasn't just a possibility. It was a performance wrapped in blood, spectacle, and strategy. Every time they stepped into the arena, they weren't just risking injury or humiliation. They were flirting with the finality of death, knowing full well that their lives could end before thousands of roaring spectators. In the early Republic, gladiatorial combat was raw and decisive. One man left standing, the other crumpled in the dirt. But as Rome's appetite for blood grew more sophisticated, so did the rules of death. It wasn't always about who survived, it was about who entertained. Gladiators fought not only for victory, but for favor. Winning a bout didn't guarantee survival. Losing one didn't always mean death. It all came down to the final moment, the pause. After one fighter went down, he might raise his index finger to plead for mercy. The crowd would lean forward, the air would go still. The final call rested with the editor, the man who paid for the show, usually a senator, general, or even the emperor. Yet often he turned to the crowd. And that's when things got unpredictable. The Roman mob could be merciless, swayed by mood, alcohol, or sheer bloodlust. Their roars, cheers, or thumbs became an instrument of life or execution. Much has been said about the infamous thumbs up, thumbs down signal, but the truth is murky. Some ancient sources suggest that a turned thumb, pollis verso, mimicked a sword's motion, meaning death. A thumb pressed into a fist, pollis compresso, may have symbolized sheathing the weapon, a gesture of mercy. But no one truly agrees, and the crowd's decision was rarely subtle. Sometimes they held their hands flat, shouted, "Kill," or "Spare him." The will of thousands swelled into a verdict that the editor then enforced. If mercy was granted, the fallen gladiator was spared. He would be carried back to the barracks, bloodied but alive, possibly to fight again. But if the death sentence was handed down, the ritual was solemn and grim. The victor, having earned the honor, was expected to kill his opponent swiftly and cleanly, often a plunge of the blade to the neck or heart. There was an unwritten code in this moment. The loser was not to cry, not to beg. He knelt or lay still and accepted his fate. To die quietly was to die well, and to do so with bravery might earn respect or even a place in myth. Once the body fell still, another ritual began. Attendants dressed as Death, called Charon after the mythical ferryman of the underworld, entered the arena. Wearing eerie masks and dark robes, they carried hammers or heated irons. Their job was simple and brutal: to ensure the dead were truly dead. If any sign of breath remained, they finished the job. The body was then dragged through the Porta Libitina, the gate of death, named after the Roman goddess of funerals. The sand was raked clean. The crowd settled. The next match began. There were no moments of silence, no funerals, no eulogies. The games moved on, as relentless as Rome itself. Death was a feature, not a flaw. In the arena, each gladiator lived on the edge of applause and annihilation. He was watched not just by his fellow fighters or his lanista, but by the faceless thousands who decided whether he would be remembered or erased. To be a gladiator was to walk a tightrope between myth and mortality, where one slip could end your story and one moment of valor could etch your name into eternity. In the Colosseum, mercy was never a rite. It was a performance. And behind every cheer was a sword's shadow, waiting for its cue. When most people think of Roman gladiators, they picture brutal fights, roaring crowds, and the clash of steel echoing through the Colosseum. What they rarely imagine is what came after. The stillness that follows the spectacle. The silence that crept in when the crowd went home and the blood dried on the sand. Because even the most celebrated warriors of the arena eventually faced a truth that no armor could protect them from it. No one fights forever. The end didn't always come dramatically, mid-fight with a fatal blow and a crowd gasping in unison. Sometimes it arrived quietly, like a shadow, an aging body that could no longer keep up, a bad match against a younger opponent, or simply the passing of time. Glory was fleeting. For many, their final chapter unfolded far from the spotlight. Some were granted their freedom, a rare honor marked by the gift of a rudis, a symbolic wooden sword. It was a gesture of respect and release, signaling that a gladiator had earned the right to live outside the arena. But freedom was often more symbolic than practical. After years of living by the sword, few had savings, trades, or homes to return to. Gladiators were men trained for war, not for peace. Many ended up as trainers in other gladiator schools, drilling the next generation in the same brutal arts that had defined their lives. Others wandered, clinging to fame that faded faster than their scars healed. A few returned to the games, either by choice or desperation, not to chase glory, but because there was nowhere else to go. Others met darker fates. Many never left the arena. They died in the sand, their names forgotten as quickly as they fell. No applause, no honor, just silence as their bodies were dragged out, stripped of gear, and buried in unmarked pits on the city's edge. There were no gravestones, no mourning families, only the memory of a crowd that had cheered one moment and moved on the next. And then there were those who lived on, but not whole. The games left them broken. Gladiators didn't retire with pensions. A crushed leg, a mangled arm, a wound that never healed. These weren't rare, they were common. Without real medical care, many lived in pain, patched up with crude salves or simple bandages. Some were lucky enough to be cared for by former patrons. Others begged, disappeared, or simply wasted away in the slums. For all the admiration they once drew, most were eventually forgotten. The Colosseum itself began to fade. As the Roman Empire crumbled under its own weight, the appetite for blood sports dulled. Gladiatorial combat, once the pinnacle of Roman entertainment, was increasingly viewed as a relic of a pagan past. By the early 5th century, the games were outlawed. The grand amphitheaters, once pulsing with life and violence, grew quiet. Vines crawled over cracked stone. The sands no longer drank blood. The roars became echoes. And then, silence. Yet the memory of the gladiator didn't vanish. Their stories linger, in scratched graffiti on crumbling walls, in the faded murals of ancient villas, and in the bones unearthed by modern archaeologists. These remnants speak not just of death, but of resilience. They are reminders of men who lived short, brutal lives, yet were admired, feared, and remembered. The end of the gladiator wasn't just the end of a fighter, it was the end of a cultural icon. A brutal, complex, and strangely revered tradition that defined an age. And though the arena has long since emptied, the shadows of those who once fought there still stretch across history, bloody, broken, and unforgettable. At dawn, long before the gates of the amphitheater creaked open and the roar of the crowd began to rise, another kind of drama unfolded in the silent, stone-walled corridors beneath the arena. It wasn't the pageantry or the glory that would soon spill across the sands above. It was the grim, methodical ritual of preparation, the real, raw act of turning flesh and fear into fury, of transforming condemned men into living weapons. One strap tightened, one scar traced, one breath held at a time. Gladiators awoke early, not from anticipation, but because they had no choice. Sleep, already light and fragmented, was severed by the barked commands of trainers and the metallic thrum of blades being tested against wooden blocks. The stale air of the sleeping quarters was thick with the pungent mixture of oil, blood, leather, and unwashed bodies. Rising from thin straw mats laid directly on cold stone floors, the men moved slowly at first, stretching limbs bruised and stiffened from prior bouts. Their joints popped in protest, old wounds reopened, and yet no one flinched. To show pain was to mark yourself. Pain was a predator, and this world had no room for prey. The day began not with armor, but with the body. Oiling the skin wasn't mere vanity. It served dual purposes. It made a fighter harder to grasp in close quarters and accentuated muscle tone for the benefit of the crowd, who preferred their carnage to look like theater. Every piece of attire was layered deliberately, bandages where the skin had split open, talismans tied around wrists for luck, greaves strapped on with silent precision. Some men whispered urgent prayers to long-forgotten gods. Others stared ahead, blank-faced, hollowed by routine. Most said nothing. Thoughts were hidden deep, buried under fear and fatigue. Today could mean triumph, or dismemberment, or death. You didn't dwell on it. You couldn't afford to. Weapons came next. This was where individuality flickered through the haze. Each man had a style, a preference. Some favored the gladius, short and brutal. Others, the curve of the sika, built for slicing past shields. Others still fought with tridents and nets, dodging instead of blocking, dancing instead of clashing. Fighters didn't always get to choose their gear. Some were trained to embody enemy types. Barbarians, Greeks, Carthaginians, each costume a role in the grand Roman drama. The murmillo carried the weight of a broad shield and a crested helmet, nearly blind inside its thick metal. The thorax fought with a curved blade and elaborate greaves. The retiarius bore no armor, armed only with a net, a dagger, and the unbearable vulnerability of exposed skin. Trainers stalked the room, watching, judging. They corrected stances, adjusted grips, and issued last-minute warnings. Fear was never addressed. Efficiency was all that mattered. No slips, no softness, no mercy. By the time the sun cleared the highest towers of the arena, the atmosphere had changed. Noise filtered in from above, a growing hum of anticipation. Vendors shouted over one another, selling skewers of meat and wine-soaked fruit. Horns bellowed. The drumbeat started, deep, slow building. The first rows of spectators shuffled in, their chatter forming a restless tide. Below, the fighters fell silent. Some paced like caged animals. Others sat cross-legged, heads bowed, trying to force steadiness into trembling hands. A few etched symbols into the dirt with their fingertips, prayers, initials, memories. When the summons came, it was not theatrical. It was cold, direct. They lined up, not like men, but like tributes. Each step forward brought them closer to the blinding glare of daylight, to the sand, to the roar of thousands whose eyes would not blink as bodies broke. They entered not as individuals, not as fathers or brothers or sons. They stepped forward as faceless actors in Rome's favorite illusion, and the crowd waited, hearts pounding, hands sticky with wine, ready to cheer, to jeer, to feast on the spectacle. The arena did not crave courage. It demanded surrender. And so they marched, not toward glory, but into the belly of the beast. Not for victory, but for survival. Not as heroes, but as blood. It's early morning in the heart of the Roman Empire, and the amphitheater still lies in a rare moment of silence. But everyone knows it won't last. Today is a fight day, a day that for some will be the final chapter, and for others, the beginning of a brutal legend carved in sand and blood. For a gladiator, there's no middle ground. You either survive or you don't. There's no second place. You wake up before the sun fully crests the rooftops, greeted not by peace, but by the metallic rhythm of preparation. The clanking of iron armor, the sharpening of blades, the hollow thud of boots against stone as men pace with dread crawling up their spines. The lanista, your trainer and owner, is already yelling commands with the urgency of someone who knows hesitation means death. There's no space here for fear, no pause for pity. Your body aches from yesterday's drills, from bruises that never fully fade and muscles stretched past exhaustion. But you move anyway, because you've been trained to push pain aside like a stone in your sandal. The morning meal is humble. Boiled barley, maybe a fig, a splash of water. It's not about taste or fullness, just fuel. Anything heavier could slow your reflexes. And slow is the kiss of death. You're led to the waiting area, a shadowed corridor beneath the stands where the spectators above can't yet see you. But you can hear them clearly. Their excitement rises like a tide. They don't care who you are. They don't care if this is your first fight or your 50th. They just want the show. They shout the names of crowd favorites. They call for blood, limbs, screams. Some place bets. Some just want carnage. They came for a spectacle, and to them, you are merely a part of the entertainment. Then, the moment arrives. You are oiled, armed, and marched forward. The arena greets you like a furnace. The sun is merciless. The heat wraps around you like a cloak. The sand is hot beneath your sandals, a burning stage for life and death. The roar of the crowd grows louder, but you tune it out. The first cheer that erupts isn't for you. It's for the game. It's for the violence to come. You are not a man here. You are a role in a public fantasy. You glance across the arena and lock eyes with your opponent. Sometimes the matchup feels fair. Often it doesn't. He might be taller, stronger, better fed. Maybe he has a weapon you've only trained against once. Maybe he's already killed 5 men this season. It doesn't matter. You tighten your grip on your gladius, raise your shield, and begin to move, sideways, slowly, carefully. Every step is measured, every breath rationed. You're not fighting for victory. You're fighting to be allowed to live. When the clash comes, it's fast, violent, and punishing. A cut to the leg, a bruise to the ribs, a scratch across your face. You trade blows, block, pivot, and attack again. Time loses meaning. Minutes feel like hours. And then, suddenly, it's over. Someone is on the ground. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's him. If you're still standing, it's not yet time to breathe easy. You wait. The editor, the official who determines your fate, will judge whether your performance was worthy. Was it entertaining? Was it brave? Did you earn your life today? The crowd might cheer. They might boo. Their mood swings like a blade. You kneel. You raise your finger to beg mercy, or bow your head to accept the end. You listen for the signal. If you're fortunate, the editor spares you. You rise, shaking, bleeding, alive. You've earned another day. If not, you become part of the sand, a smear of blood on stone, another name forgotten by nightfall. This is the truth behind the glory sold in stories. A gladiator's life is not one of honor. It is one of survival. Chained, bought, trained, and thrown into combat for the entertainment of others. Each breath is a gamble. Every cheer might be your last. and every sunrise might be the beginning of your final day.